Hey, Lions Nation! We're back with another exclusive video bringing you all the latest news about our beloved Detroit Lions. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss anything about the team. Now, let's get into the news. The morning he stepped through the sliding glass doors at the team facility, the air in Allen Park seemed to collect around him, like the building's HVAC had suddenly become aware there was new weather inside and needed a second to adjust. Nobody had to be told who he was. His presence arrived first, a tidal swell of the game's old fears and new possibilities, followed by that unmistakable calm stride, the gait of a man who has run through winter more times than winter can count. People like to say that every back is one jump cut away from looking mortal. He looked like a completely different theorem, one decision away from changing the temperature of the entire afternoon. A few equipment guys, men who have seen every type of entrance, glanced up and still needed a beat to remember to breathe. The security guard at the front desk tried not to smile and failed. On a bulletin board, behind the receptionist, underneath laminated reminders about player parking and a Halloween party that had been over for a month, someone had pinned a faded photo of a blue and silver 20 cutting back in a space that only he knew existed. The picture had been there for years, a memory and a challenge. Now there was a second frame forming in everyone's mind, an image not yet taken, of a different kind of run and a different kind of roar. It wasn't that the team had been missing identity. On the contrary, they had hammered one out with rough knuckles and a head coach who speaks about football the way a welder speaks about steel. The locker room already knew how to author the sort of Sunday that makes neighborhood dogs howl even when the TV is muted. But there are levels to the act of tilting a field. Sometimes it's a trick of geometry and motion, the OC's whiteboard inventing angles a defense hasn't practiced. Sometimes it's heat, that rising, relentless mid-game fever created by a line that keeps leaning and a back who keeps choosing violence, but with exquisite manners. And sometimes it's gravity. This was gravity arriving in a blue hoodie, shaking hands with the left guard, nodding respectfully at the center as if recognizing a fellow craftsperson, and then drifting toward a meeting room where a projector waited to spin up the same old clips that would look new again, because everything looks different when you know what the next hammer swing will sound like. There's a way the hallways fill when something big is happening. Staffers tend to move from point A to point B like they're walking along the edges of a chessboard, straight, businesslike, invisibly counting squares. That morning you could see them rounding arcs instead, broad and buoyant, pulled toward the weight of the story. The PR guys were already thinking about camera sight lines, how to capture a shoulder pad seam that fans had memorized in other colors. The strength coach passed him with a nod that meant, "We've got new plates for you if you need them, old plates if you want those, and a secret third plate that makes noise when you set it down, just to let everyone know what the room believes today." Out back, a forklift beeped in reverse, as if issuing a metronome for the entire day. The cafeteria smelled like an airport at dawn, coffee and travel and decisions. He didn't say much. He almost never does. But when the offensive staff pulled up the first cut-up, a duo run from 3 seasons back that had turned a safety's career into a cautionary tale, they watched the room shift on its axis. You could feel the future being drafted in invisible ink, the wide zone variants that had been a staple, the bash looks that would reverse the expected math, the play action that would become an accusation instead of a question. The way the boundary corner would start peeking into the backfield just enough for a deep post to be more than art on paper. In the front row, the quarterback leaned forward, elbows on knees, chin in a steeple of fingers, studying not the back, but the backers reacting to him. The safeties quivering on their heels like piano wire, the D-line's hips turning the tiniest degree inward, as if that would keep an avalanche from picking its lane. Practice was a museum tour of violence. Not the kind that threatens a helmet, but the kind that rearranges priorities. First team period. Inside run, left hash, and the guards came off the ball as though everything in their lives had been forgiven. The center posted the nose, and then climbed with so much balance he could have carried a coffee. The right tackle was the last thing a defensive end would see before reviewing film with his therapist. And behind it, that long stride that looks like a slow-motion button pressed by God, except the GPS trackers say otherwise, and the angle says otherwise, and the linebacker's silent curse says otherwise too. The plays themselves weren't complicated. Split zone, led weak from pistol, duo with the tight end motioning across to crash the end and then slipping. The OC didn't need to be clever, only honest. We will ask you to make tackles you don't want to make on downs you thought were for your stat line, and by the time you adjust, your courage will be tired. The conversation around town changed almost overnight. Detroit knows how to recognize a machine when it sees one, whether it hums on an assembly line or waits in the backfield like a storm. The same people who can tell you which year a Chevy Big Block got the carburetor it deserved can tell you the difference between yards earned and yards received as a gift from formation. They began to speak in expressions like, "Light box be damned," and "Load the wing if you dare." Sports talk callers, poets with no patience for rhyme, discussed how 2nd and 8 had become an optimistic down because even the incompletion before it had been a kind of investment. At the farmer's market, a man in a gray hoodie told his buddy that they were about to see a new flavor of the old religion. Winter ball, built not on hope or trickery or the tender dreams of spring, but on the stable physics of weight and will. Nobody forgot the history, not for a second. A franchise with a number like 20 retired doesn't get amnesia, it gets perspective. This wasn't about replacing a memory with a new one. It was about expanding the vocabulary to include both the dance and the shove, both the improvisational jazz that carved daylight between 3 defenders and the freight train gospel that wrote a sermon on someone's sternum. In position meetings, the backs talked about marrying footwork with headline, how a simple A-gap hit can feel like a press release when the safety chooses a business decision. The lines studied front structures like a language they'd been speaking informally and were now ready to teach, noticing how certain defenses disguised their run fit as a bluff, how the nickel would cheat, how the apex defender's eyes would wander toward ghosts when motion arrived. The tight ends, those part-time bouncers at the most exclusive door in sports, grinned at the idea of double teams that sounded like a garage door closing and play-action leak routes that felt like petty theft. Week 1 landed like a declaration. You could hear it from the first down, a run that stained the midfield logo with the kind of insistence that makes a front seven reconsider its life choices. Defensive coordinators speak about fits like tailors, precise, measured, shrewd, but there's a unique fatigue that comes from fitting the same hole over and over when that hole contains a decision you don't enjoy. By the end of the first quarter, the opposing sideline had started the ritual of the towel chorus, guys waving white rectangles more to move humid air than to actually surrender. But the image did its own work. The scoreboard didn't explode. It thickened. Possessions shortened into meals instead of snacks. The play clock fell in love with the offense. And on the headset, you could hear something any coach understands as well as any statistic. The other team's linebackers were already talking a little less. The surprise wasn't the long run. Everyone knew one would come. Long runs with him aren't events. They're patience payments. The surprise was the 4-yard gains that felt rude. That was the phrase an assistant used at halftime, rude yards. 2nd and 6 with a defense sighing. 3rd and 2 that ended with a safety and a nose tackle sitting in the same footprint and both looking at the numbers on the back of a jersey they'd touched but not moved. On the sideline, the receivers loved it in exactly the way you think they would and in a way you might not expect. Yes, because the post was about to be a cathedral. And yes, because they relish blocking when it means they get to participate in a demolition that includes poetry. Amon R.A. laughed after decking a corner, not because the corner deserved it, but because half a yard later a hand brushed his rib cage, the tailback loping past, and he felt more like a hinge than a man. "Hinge football," he said to the WR coach, and the WR coach nodded like a man who just found a word for a feeling he's had for 15 years. The second week brought something more subtle and more terrifying for the rest of the conference. Adjustment met with unbothered efficiency. The opponent loaded the box as if it could stack logs high enough to hold back spring. The offense responded by calling an RPO that felt like both a dare and a lullaby. The quarterback pulled, flicked to the glance route, and suddenly the safeties were texting each other in real time with their eyes. "You take him. I'll take him. Wait, that leaves him." Then came the counter with the backside guard pulling like he'd been rehearsing that single step his entire childhood. There's a joy linemen rarely get to say out loud. It's not just hitting someone. It's knowing exactly where the someone will be, and what his leverage will be, and how he'll try not to be what he'll inevitably be, just late. The ball carrier didn't even break stride. He didn't have to. The hole was a paragraph, and he was a man who prefers single-sentence declarations with a period as heavy as a bell. Everything about the offense began to change in ways that didn't look dramatic until you zoomed out. Second halves turned into campuses where thesis papers were defended with cleats. The defense suddenly afforded rest and favorable terrain, sharpened in a way that statistics never fully appreciate because there isn't a metric for linebackers arriving at the gap with a sermon already written. Special teams became a field position investment portfolio. The head coach's post-game quotes sounded even more like the man himself. Plain, forward, unseduced by either praise or panic, the way a ship's captain speaks after teaching the local ocean a polite lesson about manners. And yet there was a gleam, a private one, reserved for staff meetings and those 6 seconds after a play moments on the sideline, when two men who love the game realize it loves them back. That gleam said we can go anywhere with this. In the film room the next Wednesday, a play froze mid-motion. The tight end half a yard into his sift block, the left tackle's outside hand balanced on a defender's breastplate like a parent on a playground slide. The quarterback's head tilted toward a safety who thought he wasn't being watched. You could hear the sound of pens tapping on laminated call sheets while minds did the fun kind of math. If the backside backer steps here, it's spill, and if it's spill, we bounce, and if we bounce, the corner has to make a solo tackle on a man who remembers every time he's been underestimated. Someone rewound. Someone else laughed. The running backs coach paused and traced 2 lines with his finger, one in the air that the defense preferred and one on the table that the ball would take instead. The difference between those 2 lines was exactly the width of a linebacker's hope. You could have taken the offense's heartbeat and animated it on a screen. It would have looked like a sequence of stubborn syllables. Duo, duo, power, duo, boot, glance, duo, counter, glance again, shot, duo until the stadium understood that time is a place and the offense lives there. Fans who grew up on the poetry of a certain 20 weren't asked to abandon anything. They were asked to remember another truth just as sacred. There is a way to run the football that sounds like a sentence you end with a stamp, not a period. It's not bitterness. It's insistence. The tone of what happens when the first drive in the fourth quarter feels like a conversation your grandfather used to have with the world, back when bargains were plain and hands were thick. He never needed to speak transformation into the microphone. The transformation spoke by itself in yards after contact that felt like a climate report. Meanwhile, his presence in the building turned other people's jobs into something cleaner. The OC joked that he could cut his call sheet in half and get twice the variety. The line coach grinned like a father at a piano recital because the footwork, the pad level, the hand placement, we're starting our adventure at your chest technique. All of it suddenly took on the obviousness of a well-known recipe. The receiver coach put on a clinic about stock blocking that would make a monastery proud. And the quarterback? He started taking notes like a man whose pocket had grown an extra square yard. 35 throws felt like a feast again, not an obligation. 15 of them were tiny cuts in the same wound a defense was already nursing. Of course there were moments when the defense cheated, because that is the game's oldest sin and most reliable comedy. There was a series in Chicago when the front slanted so hard the right tackle felt like he was run-blocking a rumor. The call was inside zone, the fit got ugly, and the back bounced to daylight because a corner tried to write a check with a shoulder that had not read the memo. He is a big man, and big men often go around people the way trains go around mountains, by deciding the map is wrong. But the most frightening thing he did that day wasn't trucking anyone or outrunning a safety who forgot to take a good angle. It was a carry on 2nd and 10 after a negative play against a loaded box for 5 yards that looked like a tax the defense would pay every April for the rest of their lives. Some players change a team's style. This changed a team's weather. December stopped being a month on the schedule and turned into a resource, a material you could work with like wood or iron. Cold outside, warm inside, the roof above a dome humming like a polite secret. And yet, even in climate control, you could feel the season harden into something sharp and honest. Late in the year, drives began to resemble biographies. You could see a childhood in Alabama stitched into the angles. You could see Saturday afternoons that taught patience the way church teaches patience. You could see pro fronts trying to reduce an equation that refused to cooperate. On the sideline, the defensive coordinator smiled into his call sheet because 3rd and 4 for the other team had grown into a statistic he could trust. a weather pattern that let him leave the umbrella at home. By then, the city had adopted a rhythm. The Monday morning commute sounded different, like the accelerators of 1,000 pickups were downshifted a half-inch further. At diners, people moved salt shakers into the gaps on the table to explain why certain cutbacks were inevitable. In barbershops, men argued good-naturedly about whether the post over the top was more lethal than the drift route stealing the space behind a linebacker drunk on play action. Kids wore zeros and 80s and 16ths, and a brand new 22 stitched into sweatshirts that smelled like laundry detergent in winter. It wasn't about celebrity. It was about a civic sensation you only get when everyone has the same picture in their head of what a third quarter should feel like. Polite cruelty, the kind that never whispers, the kind that ends with the opposing fan base describing themselves as exhausted on talk shows. There were setbacks, because football never forgets to be itself. One Sunday came with a front that slanted into chaos and a Mike linebacker who guessed right 3 times in a row like a man at a roulette table on his birthday. A series died, then another. The broadcast booth used phrases like bottled up and contained as if they had discovered new planets. But then the fourth quarter arrived, and the floodgates looked around and realized they had never been closed, only waiting for a gust. The line found its old pads. The tight ends down block began to sound like a property dispute. And the back, who had been patient all afternoon in the way a great actor waits to deliver the line you'll quote for years, took a handoff that hit backside so snug the defense misreported the crime. 17 yards and a heartbeat later, the entire stadium remembered that football is a story, and some chapters exist only to make the ending taste better. By the time the standings started to matter the way they always do, like rent, the staff meetings had a ritual that felt like holy mischief. The OC would open with a compliment for the week's opponent, a sincere one, because pro-respect is its own oxygen. Then he would begin to quietly, humbly, rearrange the chessboard in his head, placing linebackers into boxes they did not enjoy, drawing a line through a defensive end's ribcage on the legal pad of his mind, identifying the 2 or 3 safeties in the league who tackle with joy, and deciding to make even them earn it. The QB would study the pictures, not because he didn't already understand them, but because this is what craftsmen do with each other in the winter. They admire the edges of the tools and talk about torque like it's a grandfather whispering old truths. And the back would sit there with his arms folded, an expression that looked like focus and felt like mercy he hadn't decided to withhold yet. It changed the way the rest of the roster imagined themselves as well. The defense learned that a 3-and-out doesn't have to carry the drama of a rescue mission. Sometimes it can just be a kind favor returned. The slot receiver learned that a 3-step slant against quarters after a heavy personnel look can feel like a vacation. The left tackle learned that his best down may be the one nobody notices because the ball's already 7 yards downfield and the defensive end's hands are carefully placed in a museum of futility. The fullback, or the tight end playing fullback in short yardage, learned the exact angle his shoulder needed to find so that the middle linebacker would spend the rest of the quarter speaking in shorter sentences. And the kicker learned a delicious boredom. Fewer 53-yard prayers, more 28-yard chores. On the road, in the sort of stadium where boos begin at breakfast, the offense had its most elegant drive. It began with a motion that made a nickel step left just enough. It continued with a pin pull that looked like choreography for aerospace engineers. Angles so clean you could eat from them. It featured, at its most unsubtle apex, a run on 3rd and 3 where the back met the safety at a depth and timing that made you question whether time is, in fact, a flat circle. The collisions sounded like wood deciding to become a chair. The chains moved. The announcer did that little stutter they sometimes do when the unexpected is also obvious. And then the whole thing ended with the sort of play-action shot that spoils defensive backs for entire months. A route that took a full 7 seconds to reach its poetry and an arc that made you wonder whether the ball had filed a flight plan. Touchdown. And the camera cut to the sideline, where helmets bumped like champagne flutes at a New Year's party for people who do not smile unless the reason is morally sound. Before we move on, take a second to drop a like and subscribe. That way, you'll stay up to date with every exclusive Lions update, and you'll even have a chance to win an official Detroit Lions jersey. Let's keep going. There is a philosophical component to this brand of ball that the city understands intuitively. People who work with their hands know that some jobs are not about speed as much as they are about power delivered with precision. They know you cannot simply want to move an object. You have to position your body and the object's future so that movement becomes the only reasonable outcome. This offense learned to occupy that tone. Third quarters became less about the scoreboard and more about rehearsing a conclusion. The microphone on the center's chest picked up less chatter and more breath. The cadence sounded like a judge's gavel. And on the field, 11 men sent the most gracious message a team can send. We will keep offering you the same choice until you understand it was never a choice. Fans began to talk in strokes and tendencies, to speak a little film room in the grocery line. You can't live in nickel against that, a woman told her husband as they debated cereal. You just can't. Kids on playgrounds recreated runs, not the long ones you'll find on highlight reels, but the modest, loyal ones that change down in distance and, eventually, change lives. In the noise of an arena born for noise, something quieter took root too, a confidence that did not need to say its own name. You could feel it an hour before kickoff, walking past charcoal and smoke and laughter. There is a way a community stands when its team has a plan that includes them. Shoulders lift differently. Voices rest a notch lower. People point less, nod more. They know the evening's story arc by heart. The opening, the test, the insistence, the lesson, the signature. All the while, he kept running the way he does, upright and downhill like a letter mailed from a past century when addresses were written with fountain pens and the mailman was a neighbor. The jawline of the league sharpened accordingly. It isn't that the style is unbeatable, nothing is. It's that it demands you prove your endurance in a game that pretends to be about speed. It asks 190-pound men who talk like lion tamers to decide whether they want to be animal control or a strong suggestion the animal ignores. It makes defensive ends play honest on a boot after an entire half of being told run first, I second. It politely suggests that making a business decision is an expensive habit. In a league that worships explosive plays, it makes the quietest play, 4 yards on first down, sound like a hymn. When the calendar turned and the games began to carry the ancient promise of winter, the identity had crystallized. The team jogged out not like a visiting party to an uncertain party, but like the owners of a trade, the keepers of a canonical approach. The backfield looked less like a location and more like a thesis statement. The offensive line walked to the line of scrimmage as if the turf owed them rent. The quarterback's footwork told truths about calm, about being protected by an idea as much as by 5 large humans. And the head coach's face, part smile, part dare, looked like a lighthouse that has seen storms and kept its appointment with the night anyway. On the biggest stage, with the lights so bright they made Gatorade sparkle like a small ocean, the offense began with the same manners it had practiced for months. Duo into a heavy front. Duo into a mugged-up A-gap. A glance route to punish curiosity. A boot to make a defensive end eager, then humble. Then the sequence that will live without a name, because it doesn't need one. Under center, condensed formation, motion to stack, the snap, the double, the sift, the step, the handoff into a moment that looked like static until it wasn't. He found daylight not because daylight had been forgotten by the defense, but because daylight is stubborn if you ask it nicely. He hit the crease and then, with a long, unhurried stride, erased 2 angles and a pre-game show's worth of predictions. Not a sprint, a decision. The noise arrived like weather. In the press box, even the neutral writers felt the honest compulsion to write verbs in the present tense. Afterwards, in a locker room noisy with relief and promise, he sat at his stall the way he always does, cleats unlaced but not yet removed, a towel across his shoulders, eyes with that faraway courtesy that great athletes sometimes have, as if they're already shaking hands with the next problem. Reporters formed a polite crescent and asked polite questions about reads, about trust, about how a defense looks different from 6 inches behind a guard's hip. He answered with short, sturdy sentences. The offensive line leaned into their own conversation about hand placement, and when, exactly, they felt the game give. Coaches walked by with smiles that didn't need to be large to be convincing. On a metal bench, a helmet sat by itself, a silent instrument that had just played a familiar song in a new key. The city didn't sleep much that night. Some stayed up to watch replay shows that spoke in muted awe about leverage and inevitability. Some drove slow laps around blocks they'd lived on for decades, windows down in winter like the air had finally remembered something it owed them. People texted each other diagrams on napkins, photos of whiteboards, terrible sketches of pin and pull with arrows going in all directions like plans for a bank heist. There was laughter, and sometimes quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a long-held breath. And underneath it all, an understanding that the game had not been reinvented so much as it had been restored to a tone Detroit considers honest. Move your person, move our person, choose a gap. We choose the same gap, see you there. In the months that followed, the ripple effects turned into a tide. Free agents looked toward Detroit and saw not just money and scheme, but a place where the work matched the words. Draft boards tilted toward prospects who enjoyed the hard parts. Receivers with mean streaks called their agents. Guards with frames like warehouse doors watched cut-ups and whispered, "I want to live there." Defensive players, paradoxically, also noticed. They saw a team whose offensive identity made defensive life righteous. Fewer sudden changes, more situations where a pass rusher could be himself instead of a firefighter. The organization took on the aroma winning teams have. Not cologne, not sparkle, but the clean, iron smell of a well-kept shop. In the end, and ends in football are simply the points where one chapter hands a wrench to the next. What changed was not a stat line, or even just a win total, though those changed too. What changed was the standard for what runs should feel like here. The act stopped being about escape and became about persuasion. You don't flee a defense. You invite it to a place where your strength is at home and its courage gets tired. The ball didn't hurry. It insisted. The line didn't beg for push. It authored push. The quarterback didn't recite answers. He took dictation from geometry that had been simplified by the kind of fear that wears shoulder pads and asks to be ended. And the back, the man whose arrival had bent the day's sunlight, whose gait contained 1,000 quiet arguments on behalf of winter, kept offering the same patient sermon. We will keep coming until you agree that the earth tilts this way. Detroit understood. The pictures in the hallways found a new neighbor. The old photo remained, not as a comparison but as a companion. The way a city keeps both a cathedral and a factory on postcards because they are both its face. On practice fields where footprints tell stories you can read like Braille, the grooves deepened into a signature. In meeting rooms where the truth speaks in clickers and pause buttons and arrows, a language that had always been spoken here learned some new verbs. And on Sundays, when the air inside the dome hums and the winter outside leans against the building like a friend, the game becomes what it should be when people who love work meet a task that deserves them. Hand it off. Make a choice. Keep making that choice until time agrees. Then look up, shake hands with the men who tried to stop you, and walk toward the tunnel with the politest swagger in the world, knowing that the field is not a place you visited. It's a place you changed. We bring you the latest Lions news every single day. So make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing. And of course, drop a comment below with your thoughts on today's news. Your voice makes a difference for Lions Nation. See you in the next video.